Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ramos Law Difference Makers podcast. And as your host, Dr. Jim Hoven, it is my pleasure to always have guests that are doing cool things, making a difference. And today I get to chop it up, so to speak, with our director of our medical sciences division, Dr. Don Cooper. He and I have had a couple of these shows in the past. So if you like what you hear today, look back through our catalog and you'll see some really interesting conversations that we've had. And we're going to actually do an extension of that today. We're going to talk about some of the latest things in COVID as of 2023, as well as the process of treating those who have been injured by COVID vaccines and are experiencing long COVID. So hold on to your seats, hold on to your brains. This one's going to get a little bit deep from time to time because I am with one of the deepest thinkers I know. Dr. Cooper, welcome back, man. Thanks for joining me on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's great to be here.
We're going to have some fun.
Yeah.
You have put so much time into this effort of understanding, for lots of reasons, but I mean, being the head of our medical sciences division, you really want to understand this because we're helping people that have been injured by vaccines. Does that mean everyone gets injured by vaccines? Of course not. But there are things that are actually, that we're seeing, that there's patterns emerging, and you've put your whole heart, your soul into understanding the issue COVID. What's the latest? Where's it at? What about vaccines and injuries that can come from them? So can you just maybe bring us up to speed since our last conversation, which has been months ago, on kind of what you found in the whole umbrella of the COVID vaccine relationship?
Yeah. So last time we spoke, I was maybe it was about a year ago, maybe a little bit less, but we were just starting to see Omicron, the first variants of Omicron. We didn't really know where that was going. It turns out to be a variant that was more infectious, but it didn't turn out to send more people to the hospital. So that was good. I was predicting that we were just going to start seeing a treadmill of variants coming along.
I remember us talking about that.
And that turned out not to be true, thankfully. But recently there is a new variant of Omicron that's started on the East Coast that's taking over. It's the XBB 1.5. Again, this one, it tends to be even more infectious, but again, not as severe. So
is that the life cycle? I hate to interrupt you, but I'm interested because, and by the way, give people just a little background before you answer this question. So here's the question. Is that a typical viral maturity sequence as viruses evolve from one level to the next? Is it common for them to get from more virulent to less virulent? In other words, harder on people's systems and maybe more contagious, but less powerful? Is that a common thing or uncommon thing? But before you answer, give people a background on why you picked this information up so quick on your PhD, your study, because this is who you are way before COVID ever happened.
We started this, we had the first study in the U.S. on looking at antibodies back in March of 2020. So they'd sequenced the SARS-CoV-2 virus back in January. It was very quick. And then by March, we had, Dr. Ramos and I had the first study looking at antibodies. And we were essentially trying to understand how vulnerable populations, older populations, how they would respond with mounting an antibody response. And then when the vaccines came along, we were interested in how the vaccines would turn on the antibody responses in these same vulnerable populations versus younger populations. And so that kind of lent itself, once we started getting the vaccines, there were a lot of questions about, well, how long do they last? And if you get vaccinated once, are we just going to need one? If you recall the first conversation, just that with these there was the mRNA vaccines, that was a departure from the previous technology of using either a live virus or a heat-killed virus in order to produce the vaccination. These mRNA backbones or vectors are more effective at engaging and activating the immune system. So that's absolutely true. But at that time, we thought that we were only going to need one. And then when the virus, there's this interplay between the virus mutating and then the vaccine that can counter that. And so then we needed another a booster shot, and then another booster. And now we're at the point where we understand that there's a half-life to the antibody titer, the amount of antibodies that are circulating, any given person will respond. In about 8 months, you lose half of your antibodies.
Is that common of other vaccines? I mean, that's the normal process, right?
It is. It's just, the time course may be different because that's specific, and we didn't know about mRNA vaccines. But it turns out if we were to compare, let's see, we have an opportunity to compare vaccines that were developed in China and in Europe that were the more traditional technology that were based on heat-killed viruses. And that's more the traditional, what we use for seasonal influenza, for example. Right.
So you take just for people who don't know this procedure, you take a virus, you kind of kill it so it can't do a lot of damage, and then you introduce it in the body so that the body goes, ooh, I recognize that thing in this level. And then when it sees the live, real version, it goes, ooh, I've seen that before. I want to go take care of business.
Right. And when you're using that traditional method, it turns out that it's not as efficacious at preventing the infection. It's about 50 to 60%. But whereas your mRNAs, we were getting up to 90% effectiveness, and so in keeping people out of the hospital. So
not of them getting sick. It wasn't 90% of them saying, "Oh, I won't get COVID." It was 90% that if you get it, you're not going to go to the hospital. Is that the effectiveness you're talking about?
So it was hard to discern, whether or not at no point did virologists, people, immunologists, people who really understand, think that the mRNA vaccines were going to prevent infection. And there was a lot of information that was coming out, oversimplification, I'd say, from a number of different sources. Unfortunately, even CDC and FDA were leading us to believe that people weren't going to get infected, and that just wasn't true.
Because it's never
we
true.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
But it was true that they were effective at keeping people out of the hospital, and that was enough because at that time, if you recall, there was this whole idea of flattening the curve, and we have to preserve the capabilities of our hospitals, and that was prime. That was a priority. But going back to the differences between your live viral vector and your mRNA, they tend to be the live viral vectors vaccines were less efficacious, but the viral titers lasted longer. So you didn't get this precipitous decline over 8 months. It tended to last longer, but it wasn't as efficacious. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah.
But with the Pfizer and Moderna variants, it turns out that about 8 months you lose half of it. So if you think about that, right now, people who got vaccinated early on may only have 25%, 10% of the original antibodies.
And would that be for the variant or for the thing that they were vaccinated against?
That would be for the first variant. That's the alpha versions. And then as if you add on top of that the variants that are escaping, with each variant there's a little bit of escape. Because the variants they flourish in some environment. It's kind of like antibiotic resistance. As long as you have some circulating antibody, it's not complete, then you're going to automatically select for a variant that can grow under those conditions. So we're all kind of like a petri dish, and so you're selecting for more and more resistance, and that's exactly what happened. So now we have, if you take a snapshot of where we're at right now, that initial Pfizer shot or Moderna shot, and that second shot where people are considered fully vaccinated, are almost it's not effective at all.
Almost inert at this point.
You had to have gotten the booster, and then that gave you maybe 50% protection, and then people got ill and they got the infection. They're called super immune, so they had the fully vaccinated booster and they got the illness, and so they actually have some protection against future variants. So it's kind of a
it's a hodgepodge.
It's kind of a hodgepodge. It's kind of a treadmill. I know it was a treadmill on the variants, but it's kind of like it's a boon for pharmaceutical companies that are in the business of making the latest, greatest vaccine du jour.
And it's so weird because when you think about it, given the nature of things and everything that you just described, there's always going to be this carousel of rotating, evolving viruses, right? Or whatever. So we or you guys as a scientific community are trying to figure out how to help the next one. And like you say, there is a financial boon for these things to be effective because it helps people when it helps them. But also it almost, here's my concern. What happens when you start stacking these things again and again and again on stuff that we know isn't going to be effective now, and it was effective to whatever it was. Now we get the next one, now we get the next one. Can your body only take so much of that? It's not like you're putting vitamins in that your body needs as essential nutrients or something. These are exogenous things. And if it is the case that the toxic load can increase, is that why we're seeing some of the stuff that we're seeing in the med sciences division where people are having injuries or reporting things they never felt before after, like, they've been healthy for blank years, they take a vaccination, one or a combination, and then all of a sudden they're sick? Is there a logical connection between all of that?
I think that remains to be seen, but it makes sense. And if you know, if I were to represent the most common thing that people talk about when they talk about their vaccine injuries is that they were healthy before, they're active. A lot of them were like that. They didn't have problems. And then they got the vaccine, they were laid out for a few days with expected flu-like symptoms, which happened to almost 60% of people who had them. Headache, fatigue, those kind of things. And then right around the point at which the antibodies come on fully, maybe about two to 3 weeks, they started experiencing a whole host of physiological changes that are, you know, when we look at it now, they're consistent with inflammatory disease, inflammatory vasculitis, inflammation of vasculature, neuropathies where they're experiencing tingling sensations and pain in their extremities that moves around, and things that they just can't explain, insomnia, brain fog. And it turns out that now that we've had some time to kind of look back on it and look at this in context and look at the landscape of COVID illness and vaccine injury, what it looks like is that the people who report long COVID.
Can you define that?
Yeah, long COVID is longer than 3 months of persistent COVID-like symptoms, but it's kind of characterized by brain fog, insomnia, and vascular autonomic dysregulation. And what I mean by that is, you know, we have an autonomic nervous system that takes care of a lot of the automatic functions of our body. Our blood pressure, we don't have to think about regulating our blood pressure or having it go up or down. It happens automatically. Our basal heart rate, or whether we're sweating or not, or our body temperature,
respiration, all these things, right?
A lot of things.
Yeah.
You know, we think about it, gastrointestinal motility. All these things are controlled in an automated fashion through the autonomic nervous system. And what several people report for long COVID is a lot of these systems are going haywire. Blood pressure is going up and down. They're having racing heart rate and palpitations, and brain fog and headaches. And these are lasting longer than 3 months and persisting and getting worse. And that happens to overlap substantially with what we see with vaccine injury. So we think that there is a tight correlation between whatever's going on with long COVID and vaccine injuries. If we look at the statistics for long COVID, about 10 to 20% of the over 100 million people in this country who got COVID have long COVID symptoms. So that's
10 to 20%.
That's right.
Wow.
So we're dealing with millions of people who are experiencing dysregulation in some way of their autonomic nervous system. And some of them are seeing the doctor, some of them are trying to, you know, they don't know what's going on, so they gut it out, so to speak. And you know, I think that it's important for us to give them the right message, you know, and that message is if you're starting to experience these things, especially if you've had a vaccine injury, where you can do something about it, because we have the ability to engage a compensation program and potentially, you know, help you.
And that's so if they're feeling long COVID symptoms and had the vaccine, or long COVID symptoms and a vaccine injury? I think people are going to listen to this and they're going to go, you know what? What if I got vaccinated, I followed the schedule, and I still have long COVID? I got sick after the vaccination. I feel like crap, and I'm still having these symptoms. Is that something that's because of the vaccine, or would I have gotten a worse case of that if I wouldn't have gotten vaccinated? Like that's a weird dynamic.
Yeah, so it's going to be, if you just look at the statistics at the population level, turns out people who were vaccinated are less likely to get symptoms of long COVID. So there is some benefit overall if you look at the population level. Now, that's not to say that people who get vaccinated there's a fraction of them. In fact, everyone who calls us has this, where they are experiencing absolutely they're experiencing some new physiological manifestation that's caused by or exacerbated by the vaccine. And if they had COVID as well, then the two could be working together. We don't fully understand why, but that kind of brings us to my second study. Dr. Ramos and I have 2 clinical trials right now that are registered with clinicaltrials.gov. And the NIH, National Institute of Health, is sending people to our study for the vaccine adverse reactions and etiology study when they have these types of symptoms. And so we are looking into these mechanisms, and one of the hypotheses that we have is that all of us have a unique complement of genetic polymorphisms or mutations. And these are silent mutations that convey risk to certain pathologies. That's why some people get cancer and other people don't get cancer. Some people get autoimmune disorders, potentially like Guillain-Barré or multiple sclerosis, and other people don't. And it has to do with our unique complement of genetic background.
And so if I can simplify that for our audience, essentially our sequences of our genes, there are these long sequences, and some of them have alterations of what ideally they would be, and that makes them predisposed. A particular gene, if it's not exactly right, if it's not the perfect copy of what it should be, then it can be susceptible to something. This gene could be susceptible to A condition. This gene, which is down the line, could be susceptible to B condition, et cetera. It's not that That's right. Gene could be A, B, C, or D. Mm-hmm. It's specific genes potentially susceptible to specific conditions.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, and there's some good examples of, there's one example for dementia, for Alzheimer's risk. It's called ApoE, and it's ApoE4. There's a variant. And there's a double mutation in that gives an 85% likelihood of getting Alzheimer's by the time you're 80. And so,
is there anything you can do about it if you see these gene aberrations, or that's just the cards you've been dealt, and so best luck? Is there an epigenetic factor? And we can come back to COVID specifically, but like when you talk for dementia, if you see that and it gets identified, is there things you can do if you find it when you're 50 that would alter that state?
It's kind of like, the story with Angelina Jolie and the BRCA mutations for breast cancer and uterine cancer. It's if you have that double variant, then usually you have a family history, and that means that you have something like 85% chance of getting cancer. And so the what can you do there? Well, it's some prophylactic treatment. Is double mastectomy is something that can prevent that. So that's kind of severe, but that's an extreme example of what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And if you look at all the possible genes that are involved with how the immune system responds to an antigen, how the immune system responds.
And define antigen.
Antigen is any pathogen, any foreign object, any foreign substance. It consists of bacteria, viruses, toxins, anything that would activate your immune system. And remember, you have 2 components to your immune system. You have an innate immune system, which is responsible for your fever, which are derived from pyrogens that are released that cause your body temperature to increase in order to fight off the pathogen. You have inflammatory cascades that increase circulation to allow T cells and macrophages to get in there and clear out the infection. And then you have your active component, which is where you have T cells going in there and clearing out infected cells. You have antibodies, neutralizing antibodies that bind to the pathogen and remove it. Right, and so you have these two components, and you can have genes there's several genes involved with making sure that this system works properly. Now, when you add a vaccine, you're engaging all of that cascade, and it is possible that you can hyperactivate that, and you get essentially something like an autoimmune issue that can target in ways that we don't completely understand, but it can target the vasculature. And when it does that, you get inflammation of your vasculature, and that means
is that the myocarditis
clots.
Stuff that kind of thing that is
that
being
we'll put that in there.
Tied?
That's swelling of the heart muscle, and also pericarditis is the sac surrounding it, where that causes some fluid and inflammation, and that makes it more difficult for your heart to function. But also even microclots, even at the level of clotting of the red blood cells themselves, you can get clotting in your extremities. And people, and that affects the circulation. And so we've seen clients that have extreme edema. I mean, they'll gain 40 pounds in 2 days.
Which was because of the cascading effect you were just talking about of getting vaccinated and them having a genetic weakness or alteration leading to a predisposition of this. Wow.
That was our hypothesis. And so we couldn't understand. I mean, nobody really understood how someone could go from being healthy to getting a vaccine to within a couple months having extreme edema, having blood clots, things like that, microclots. And when we started looking, we're only starting to see, we're doing whole genome sequencing as part of the study. And what that means is we're sequencing the entire genome, the genes, the spaces between the genes that don't code for proteins. The entire thing is about 8 billion bases that we're looking at. And you really think about this, 20 years ago, this would have cost about $20 million to do one person, and now we can do it for $200.
Wow.
So that's something that we do as part of the study, and our clients that we take on to go to the compensation program, we feel that it's important for us to present that data to the court, that they know that there's an underlying genetic predisposition, and we've in fact seen it. We've seen that there's some people who have clotting genetic factors of 50 genes that puts them in the 100th percentile, which is if you have 10,000 people who get sequenced, they're in the top 100 for having a risk for a clotting factor. And these are the people that we're seeing after vaccination, they end up with a blood clot. And so we feel like we can take that, and it's not just blood clots that we see for the genetic risks. We're also seeing it with dementia and brain fog and other things. So we're starting to reap the benefits of looking at this genetic approach and seeing that we do think that there is a complex interaction between the immune activation that comes from the vaccine and a person's underlying genetic susceptibility. And that we plan on using that combination in order to advocate for our clients that these are people who had this predisposition, and this explains why the vaccine, but for that vaccine being administered, they would likely be fine. But because of that, now that put them over the edge, and that caused their vaccine injury, and they're entitled to compensation.
So of the people that we have in the program currently, do we know what percentage of them have a genetic predisposition? Like, is it, if you don't have a predisposition genetically, you're not going to have a reaction unless it's an improperly performed vaccination, which you've done a great job talking about. Is there a 1-to-1 correlation on those things, or could people still have reactions even if genetically it doesn't show that they should? Yeah,
so that's an empirical question. That's what we're looking at right now, and we won't know that until we have enough data. But it's enough for us to say, usually in science, when we say you have an N of 1, we say 1 is none. It's okay. You found some interesting thing. What does that really mean? Until we do, a more representative sample, you can't know. But you can also say that if you see a pig flying out by your window, that's a significant event, right? You don't. How many times do you need to see that to know that there's something is going on, right? That involves pigs and flying. We've seen that kind of a thing. We're seeing of the few genetic sequences that we're seeing we're seeing that the people are in the 100th percentile for the thing that they have the symptoms of. So it's not that we're seeing 100th percentile in clotting and that the person is complaining of neuropathies or headaches,
right,
or dementia. That would be an uncoupling between those two things. What we're seeing is if a person has their top 10 what's called polygenic risk score, which is the risk of having a specific pathology, their top 10 genes may all be vascular, and they happen to have clotting problems in response shortly after a vaccine. On the other hand, we may have someone who's got cognitive decline, and they have that ApoE variant, and so they're experiencing it before they'd never experienced this. So right now we're seeing a good correlation between those two things, and we'll see how that works out as we go on further in the study. But I think it's a powerful approach.
Super powerful. And could that approach of looking retroactively also be a tool proactively that for anyone to be eligible for a vaccine, if we've gone from 20 million to 200 and we're willing to spend all this money giving away, paying Pfizer, paying these guys, wouldn't it make sense that someone say, as a tool, before you get vaccinated, we're going to do this genetic test and we're going to see what your predispositions are, or can that claim be made?
I mean, I think that would be, obviously, I'm going to advocate for more diagnostics, and that's sometimes a controversial opinion with payers and insurance companies for whatever reason. They're not so interested in diagnostics, but this would be an interesting situation where if you really want to, at the population level, it would be significant. At the individual level, it would be important. But how much would a person be willing to pay to know whether or not if they're screened, whether or not what's the likelihood that they're going to have an adverse reaction? Now they have to balance that with, well, what are the chances if I get COVID? Mm-hmm. And I have a genetic predisposition to that, because you're not in the clear just because it's not just specific to vaccines. It's immune activation. So you have to balance, well, what's the immune activation associated with getting COVID, and what are the predispositions there, and are they unique from the vaccine? Now, if we're doing whole genome sequencing, we should be able to tease those two apart. We should be able to say this set of genes are more associated with COVID and long COVID. These set of genes are more associated with vaccination, and so that people are more informed when they make these complex decisions.
Man, that's impressive. That's impressive.
And I think that part of that decision-making process, I think that we missed out on as we were going through the pandemic, and that is when we started with the vulnerable populations. Those in the assisted living facilities, over 70 years old. And we said we prioritize those. And that makes sense. You want to protect them. They're relatively isolated, and so you want to make sure that you protect them. But then we started going down to the 50s, and then people who have high blood pressure, and then there are all these conditions where it's the men certainly more than women. But if you're a young female in your teens, the chances of you getting hospitalized from a natural infection of COVID was pretty small. Mm-hmm. And if you're a kid, if you're under the age of 12, chances of you getting anything, we think the reason for that is because in order for the virus to gain entry into the cells, it has to bind to a receptor called the ACE2 receptor. And it turns out that over a person's developmental lifespan, that receptor concentration increases over time, especially in men. So older men have high concentration of ACE2. They are receptors for SARS-CoV-2, right? But little kids, they have very low concentrations, very low density of that. So they're unlikely to get infected. So a more rational approach, hopefully now that we're looking at this and we can think about, well, do you really want to vaccinate kids? Is there really a risk for hospitalization? Compared to influenza and RSV, it's much lower for COVID. So we have to make better decisions about not just apply some blanket condition where we say everybody, is the same and everybody has to get it, everyone's the same. I just don't think that's true.
You brought something up as we were talking previous to going live on the air here, and you mentioned the word dogma, and specifically with a statement that you said dogma and science do not belong together, meaning that if we stop looking at something at a certain point, that's no longer science. Science is always the scientific method, right? Test it and try to break it and see this was this, now it's that.
Yep.
And it continues to evolve at all times. And so from what you just said, man, it was powerful stimulant to my brain, Dr. Don, when you said that if we could get people genetically screened, so to speak, to say, well, man, maybe you might be at risk for COVID or maybe you might be at risk for vaccination, wouldn't that go a long way from this business of mandates? When someone say, well, you can't work at my company unless you do this, in this case, get vaccinated, or you can't travel unless you do that. Well, what if that mandate caused someone to get one of these autoimmune responses that they had no choice? It was a mandate. Like, to me, do you see the moral dilemma there?
I do. And I think you can extend the idea of dogma to anything, religion, religious dogma.
For sure.
I mean, name a condition where dogma has worked out over time. Usually it's in the form of useful fictions that work for a short amount of time, but then as that's chipped away at through a scientific methodology, we become more enlightened. We understand the mechanisms of why things had worked in the past and they no longer work. But if you take away that questioning process, that iterative testing process, and in that enlightenment process, then you're stuck. You're stuck with some misunderstanding about how things work, and you're unable to respond to things. So I think that process of questioning and the idea of mandates, and this is a big problem because it's a misapplication of what science does, which is this iterative process of challenging the status quo. It's challenging whatever the previous Nature paper was. You got all these young scientists to say, I bet I can find the chinks in that armor. We can find out where that's wrong, and then they become the next Nature paper. That process is what gets us to a fuller understanding of what's really going on. But if there's some point where, and this is what I think happened, is we take some information and we freeze it there. And this is a snapshot. We say, okay, now we're going to stop all questioning. We're going to go with this, and that's when public policy, that's this uncoupling between scientific findings and public policy. And I think it's just, it's very unfortunate. Because if we were to apply that same kind of thinking to, say, the opioid epidemic, we've known for decades about how to treat drug addiction and harm reduction models and all these ways of how drugs work on our brains, and how science knows how we can minimize the effects of drug addiction in a population. When is that ever translated into effective public policy? If we had mandates about what we know, what science knows about that epidemic, we wouldn't be in the situation that we had with the worst opioid epidemic that we ever had. But for whatever reasons, with the with the pandemic, the scariness of the pandemic and the fact that this was new, we didn't know anything. Public policymakers decided that we're going to take the science, what we know right now, and we're going to run with it. And because we're going to go to the nth degree, and they went with mandates, and they gave liability waivers and indemnity to medical students administering injections. And you recall that they as part of the emergency, they were allowing medical students and pharmacy technicians to deliver vaccine injections, and this also contributed to the increase of injuries that are coming into the firm, because we're getting people who were injected who have SERVA, shoulder-induced related vaccine injuries, because it was injected too high by someone completely inexperienced who is delivering the injection.
Yeah, because they were graduating people early, right? Like they were literally taking people and matriculating them, as I recall, into the healthcare workforce to help them, be part of the front lines.
Right, and this was a non-scientific process. So once they had determined that we had a tool, then once you have the tool, everything looks like, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's what they did. they applied that, and then they deployed everyone to go out and tackle that. Now, all the vaccine, so we have a new vector, an mRNA vector, and of course, yes, mRNA vectors had been around since the 90s, and they were applied in different ways, and they've gone through all animal testing. So mRNA itself is not necessarily the issue, but if you look at all of the vaccines were targeting the spike protein. All of them. There wasn't one that went to another protein. It was just all the spike protein. And now we're starting to learn that intentionally giving, if you put in spike protein, it's pathogenic and can be toxic in and of itself. And so the fact that we didn't have any competing ideas, we didn't have much competition when it came to developing these vaccines, because our priority was get it out fast,
right?
Which I'm sure it's all a numbers game. If you're looking at a population level, they're trying to save people, so you're going to do whatever you can. But there are going to be consequences of that, and now we're starting to see the consequences, and we can't deny that there are injured people. We can't, and I think that
is anybody trying to deny that up high? Because, for example, I know that there's this big question, and I've heard this, and I know you've heard it too, because we've talked about it, where doctors are saying, I don't know that I can really push this injury as connecting it, because you've got the VAERS, which is a self-reporting, and then the doctors, I think some of them have felt pressure from their medical boards or societies or whatever, all that becomes part of this issue, part of this decision-making. And when doctors have to try to play scientists, I think that gets a little dangerous. And when scientists don't have the freedom to express to doctors what's really happening, all of a sudden you get this tied up mess where one person is afraid to report what they're seeing, right?
Yeah.
And the other people's afraid to report what they're seeing. Because you've heard, I don't know if you've heard about this, but I heard of researchers who found research that was contrary to public opinion, either not being able to get their work out in Cell, let's say, because the for whatever reason, it gets denied even though all the research was solid, or something along that line. So it's going in both the science and in the medicine.
Right.
So how do we deal with that? Or is that just something that works out because of geopolitical issues that, we just work out the best we can, and unfortunately there's going to be casualties? Well,
and you add to that social media. And I think you can't deny the role that it's played in this whole thing. And I think it kind of, if we're really gonna back it up to like an evolutionary biology level, it's kind of how I look at things. Is how is whatever we're looking at selected for, whether it's at the individual level, the viral level, or the population level, societal level. And if you look at how we got to social media being such a powerful influencer and people coming up with such bizarre ideas, it's that we as individuals, as we evolved in small groups and family groups, we were more attentive to empathy at the individual level, at the family level. So if we see one person, I think there was a study done where they asked a group of people, if you have $10 to give, and they'll tell a story about little Sarah in some other country who's suffering, some malady that she's going to die, and how much of that would you be willing to spend? And they'll say, I'll spend $10. And then they say, they'll add to it another group. They'll say, well, it's her and her little brother Joey, and they have the same thing. How much would you be willing to spend? But turns out that if you start adding another person, it goes to they're only willing to spend $8. And then if you say, what is Sally or Sarah and Joey, and then the whole village, well, then the people will only be willing to spend $4. And so it's this idea, and that's irrational in some ways, because the girl's there in every one.
Yes.
So that should be the same. It should be more. It should be going the other direction.
Right.
And I think that what this speaks to is that the way we process empathy, whatever it is about how we our moral judgments and our decision-making process, we're biased towards looking at individuals, and we're more compelled to act and expend resources on that, and that includes a societal level. So if you have put out to 10 million people this one story of this one person, that's going to drive them to do all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the basketball player who was in Russia,
Yes.
Was it
Brittany Gaynor?
That whole story, it drove people to be very compassionate, very empathetic, but it's just one person.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, you have a war going on and all sorts of atrocities are going on, but that doesn't seem as compelling. So I think we have a bug in the way that our society is, in our policy making, and the way social media plays on that kind of, if you want to call it an evolutionary bug, where stories of individuals are so compelling that it gets populations of people fired up, and then they want to direct it somewhere. And it's different than in the past, where I think without that, you make decisions. We made more decisions based on the numbers game. You're dispassionate. You're looking at how many people are this, how many people are that. But social media has really changed the game, and it's made it to where it's individual stories are magnified, and individual influencers can disproportionately influence the representation of science. So it's hard to know at the end of the day what's real information, what's not. I mean, it's a difficult process, and I don't know how you combat that.
So, and by the way, I think her name is actually Brittany Griner. I think I said Gaynor. I think so. Brittany Griner. So, and when we look at this process, at the end of the day, like you say, there's powers way beyond what you and I control, that the scientists, the medical doctors, the politicians, there's all these interactions to get things going. The companies that are making and spending millions or even trillions of dollars at this point. Let's bring it back home. You get to talk with people every day that have had their lives impacted. And from their perspective, it's as a result of the vaccine or vaccines that they took. Is there a commonality of symptoms that you see? We've talked about autoimmune stuff. We talked about cardiovascular stuff. Is there a group so that if someone's listening and they said, I had a vaccine and I was never like this, and now I'm feeling like that. You've been gathering this data. What are, if any, are the commonalities of symptoms from these types of events?
Well, I think that most of them are, they're in a state of what you might call learned helplessness. And that is, if an individual is subjected to uncontrolled stress for a certain amount of time, there's nothing they can do about it. They start to learn the lesson that nothing I do matters. And that leads to depression and anxiety. And I think that I'm seeing a lot of that. I have people who call and who are suicidal, and they're telling me that they were at that moment thinking of how they were going to do it. And sometimes I think that that's a fantasy that people have who are in a state where they've tried everything and nothing's working. And I think that if I listen to them about what are your symptoms, what's the problem, they say nothing is working. My heart, I have heart palpitations for no reason. I can't sleep at night. I can't think. My memory's shot. I can't function. I have pain that moves around. Sometimes they describe it as a demon. They feel like they're being persecuted by a demon. It goes to that kind of that level,
that depth.
Yeah. And so it may not be something that's completely, and when they go to the doctors will say, okay, well, we'll do a nerve conduction study and it comes back normal. Or they'll do this diagnostic, or they won't do any diagnostics at all, because a lot of times doctors are just interested in well, if the treatment's the same, it doesn't matter what the diagnostic is. It doesn't matter if I do this or that, because I'm only going to treat you with an NSAID or a steroid. So who cares? Sometimes doctors are like that. And so if you have somebody who's experiencing autonomic dysregulation, where their blood pressure is changing for reasons that never did in the past and now it is, their body temperature is fluctuating, they're sweating for no reason, and they have headaches and all this, you can feel that kind of loss of control over your own body can lead to depression and anxiety. And then when they go to the doctors, I say, go to see a psychiatrist. And oftentimes that's a dismissive thing. Well, we can't help you. It's all in your head, sort of attitude. No doubt that something's in their head, and there's no doubt that they have depression and anxiety. But I'm not going to say that they started with depression and anxiety and that led to, it's not that depression and anxiety came and then they just lost all bodily functions, right?
Right.
What happened is they systematically started losing aspects of their body that they had control over before. They were able to exercise. Some of these were pretty elite athletes, triathletes, that now can no longer, they have no exercise tolerance whatsoever. And so that's very devastating to somebody whose identity is wrapped up in their physiological functioning, right? And so people who go to work every day and who deliver packages and suddenly they lose the ability to, raise their arm above their head because they've got, servo, something like that. These kind of things can lead to depression and anxiety, and that just adds to it. So we see a lot of depression and anxiety. You see a lot of things like multi-system physiological disorders, vasculitis, maybe, vascular problems, I would say about 30 to 40% of the people we see, whether it's cardiac myocarditis or microclots or stroke, things like that, something related to the vasculature. We see a lot of neuropathies. A lot of people are having tingling pain sensation in their extremities that moves around. They get nerve conductions. There's a lot of small fiber neuropathy, and that requires a biopsy where they have to go in there, and that's not a trivial process. And some people are afraid to get that, but that's really the definitive way to diagnose it. We're seeing about maybe 25% of people who have small fiber neuropathy. Brain fog is something that's almost ubiquitous across all of them. So overall it seems to be a multi-system disorder that involves autonomic dysregulation, which is why we talked about. I don't know if we've talked about it now, but there's a new experimental treatment called stellate ganglion block.
Yes, you and I were talking about that. Share with us what that's about.
So this is kind of exciting because up to now there really hasn't been anything to help people with such a multiple system disorder. But one thing that it has been around for decades, and it's been used to treat things like post-traumatic stress disorder, where there's this hyperactivation. People who've been in extreme trauma, when they're in other situations, contexts that generalize to that, they can get what's called a sympathetic arousal, where they can get adrenaline, and their noradrenergic catecholamine system in their brain that is responsible for their fight or flight response causes them to feel panic. And that occurs from this top-down signaling mechanisms, where something recognizes in your brain, you recognize the context, it sends the signals down through your ganglion into your adrenal glands, you release adrenaline, and it causes changes in blood pressure, changes in heart rate, changes in gastric motility, changes in skin conductance and temperature.
Fight or flight stuff.
All of those autonomic regulations.
Yep.
So the thinking was that this is back even in the 1920s is when this started. In the 1940s is really when they started finding out that it was beneficial from soldiers who were coming back from World War II who had PTSD. But what they would do is they'd go into the neck where the descending, it's called the stellate ganglion coming down that regulates these autonomic functions. They would inject a local anesthetic, which is it's like a nerve block, and it dampens the impulses coming from the top down. And so that tended to quiet this overactive nerve bundle, and you wouldn't get the fluctuations in blood pressure and heart rate, et cetera. And so they started doing that. It was pretty successful for people who had multi-system pain and also PTSD. Well, now they're starting to do this experimental treatment on people who have long COVID and on vaccine injury, and in some cases it can be night and day. Wow. They can give this shot. It can last for months to years, where they block it and they can put in steroids. It decreases that inflammation. It calms the nerve branches, and they don't get those fluctuations in heart rate and blood pressure and those things that can. And if you think about it, it's kind of a positive feedback loop. If your body starts doing these changes and you're internalizing, you're thinking about, why is my body doing that? That can lead to a thought spiral, and that can lead to anxiety and depression and make things worse. So their thinking is that if you can give a direct nerve block to that bundle, then you can stop that initial fluctuation, and that'll give some respite to people who are really suffering. And we're starting to see experimental. This is a treatment that in the past, when it's given for PTSD, has been on the order of about $2,000 to $5,000, and it's like an outpatient surgical center. It takes 15 minutes, and we're just starting to see clinics that are opening up that are providing this service for vaccine injury and long COVID.
Wow, that's amazing. So, if someone has heard this message or knows someone who may have been injured by a vaccine or is experiencing these symptoms and is just not sure why, because they just never put it together, should they call to speak with us or go to do one of the studies? You mentioned the 2 studies that you and Dr. Ramos and our firm is involved in. Mm-hmm. What's the process for someone who's heard this and their eyes have been open to something and they want to take a next step? Is it call you, or is it take a study, or both?
Well, I think they should call us. They could call us, and we're happy to talk to them about and point them in the right direction if they're interested in these studies or clinics in their area, because we have people all across the nation. We have vaccine injuries. We service the entire nation for the Vaccine Injury Court. Right. In the study, we service the entire nation. So we have people distributed all throughout the nation, and there are these clinics for this particular stellate ganglion block. There are areas across the nation. If they're interested in finding out more about that, they can certainly contact me, Dr. Don at ramoslaw.com. And we can give them more information about that. If they have symptoms of vaccine injury, if they get a vaccine, if they're having pain in their arm, or they're experiencing any kind of autonomic issues that are within, say, 30 days of getting a vaccine, then they absolutely should, number one, go get medical treatment, because they need to document it, and they also need to get it treated, right? They need to be able to say, yeah, I'm doing everything I can to make it better. And then once they do that, they definitely should call us and find out, am I entitled to compensation? Can I be part of the study? Do I have gene variants that would make me at risk in the future? These are all things that we can help them with. The nice thing about it is that there's no charge for us to submit a claim. If they qualify, then one thing that we do is we carry the costs to file that with the Vaccine Injury Compensation Court, and if they meet the qualifications for the study, then we'll send them out the gene sequencing. So it's a win-win situation for them. There's no downside for them at all.
That's amazing. It's such a great thing. I know this has been the essentially the brainchild of you and Dr. Ramos of really wanting to make a difference here. And I know also right now the COVID vaccine isn't on the VICP table, so to speak, but that is coming based on everything that you've shared with me. Mm-hmm. But this is also applicable to other vaccines. It's not just this one. We've been sharing this one today, but if people have been injured or think they may have been injured from everything from a flu vaccine to a hepatitis vaccine, all kinds of them, they should still go through the same process, and then let us and our team, and headed by you, kind of go through that process. Is there any closing thoughts that you would have for people that they've been listening or watching this on the nature of these things? What to do? Like if they're considering getting another vaccine, is there a thing that they should be aware of, or just plunge ahead because they got the last 4, or should they get a genetic test? And not that you're giving medical or legal advice here, but just from all the things you've learned, if someone is thinking about just taking this road down, is there anything that they need to know?
Well, I think that they have to. I mean, it's difficult when you have, like we talked about before, with mandates. If someone is in a healthcare setting and their job is telling them that it's requiring them to get vaccinated, I would hope that the policymakers would look more closely at the data and start to recognize that there are varying degrees of risk, and that if somebody comes to you with a medical exemption, that they should honor that, and they shouldn't compel them to do something that's against their health. And if they do, they should know they should know that there are legal consequences to that, and so certainly employment law. There's now workers' compensation where there have been cases that have been settled in the favor of the worker who was compelled to get vaccinated from their employer. So there are legal consequences now that are coming out, where I think that maybe employers and public policy makers will be more thoughtful and less cavalier about their thinking about that, and maybe provide other options. And as far as should you get the vaccine or not, I think looking at the data is good. If you're if you're looking at kids, you have to look at the risk for that. You have to look at does the kid live with their grandma and grandpa in their house? What's the risk of them bringing it home? There's all these complicated things. If you're just looking at the risk to the child, it's pretty minimal. So they should know that. Pediatricians should be able to represent that without fear of losing their license. So we have to get rid of all of the meta issues of doctors need to speak candidly and honestly and openly about based on the data and not based on fear of their own professional careers.
That's so good.
And I think that lastly I would say is that now more so than any other time in the history of this pandemic is we have other options for treatment. So we have the Paxlovid and we have the remdesivir cocktails and things like that, which these are pharmaceutical agents that are antivirals. These have been around for a while with other viruses, and they stop the viral replication by inhibiting certain proteins, but they don't alter. They aren't genetic tools,
right?
Like an mRNA vaccine. It's not we're practicing genetic medicine with those where it's a pharmaceutical. You'll have a symptom or you won't, but you likely won't have the kind of long-lasting effects. So I would embrace those within 5 days. If you have symptoms and you have access, I would certainly recommend getting those drugs if they're available. Let me think. I think that's and as far as the boosters come along, I mean, who knows what this new variant's going to bring us. But being more skeptical of the boosters is probably warranted now in light of the fact that we have other alternatives.
What a great conversation. Dr. Don, you are always a wealth of knowledge. You inspired me so much to look at things from a 360-degree perspective because I have my way of viewing things, and it's in a very limited fashion with only so much information. So always, I hope that everyone watching and listening has gotten the same just kind of like wow perspective that I have from our time. And for those of you who are part of our audience and would like to get in contact with Dr. Don, his email is Dr. Don at ramoslaw.com, and our number is 303-733-6353. You can check ramoslaw.com out as well for more information on the website. But Dr. Don, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for the time today out of your busy schedule. Obviously, with all your big brain moving in these things, you got a lot going on. So to take the time out to share with the people what the latest is, super important. And we're going to do this more. We're going to do this more.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Well, thanks, and have a great rest of your day.
All right.
And for everyone out there, remember, you can, just like Dr. Don, get out there and make a difference.